In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to set up lighting for indoor environments. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the office environment that we've been working with in some of the previous tutorials. Just to quickly recap, this is the same tutorial which uses LOD groups so that when you move towards the keyboards, they basically will switch between the high polygon version when you're close by to the low polygon version. So in this virtual environment from this tutorial, this virtual environment already includes a number of lights. If we turn on the gizmos, you can actually see these lights within the virtual environment. So again, in the scene window, you can just click gizmos and turn these on or off so you can take a look at these lights. Now, by default, this environment actually includes 4 point lights. So point lights are the primary type of light that you would want to use to represent most indoor lights, such as overhead lights, as the artist did here. Point lights are pretty straightforward. You can dynamically adjust the range. You can turn them off. Let's actually start with that. So let's go ahead and turn a few of these lights off so that we can see what the effects are. So now we're dealing with this third light in the far distance. Notice you can affect its range. So that's basically how far out the light source goes. You can make it really small. In addition to the range, you can also affect its intensity. Do be careful with intensity. With high intensities, you do tend to bleach out your polygons. So you basically want to, in general, I recommend changing your range before you change your intensity. And then of course you can also change your color, so you can do all kinds of interesting color effects depending on what your goal is. For this particular tutorial though, I'm actually interested in turning off all of the lights. I'm going to create a dark office environment, so I'm turning off all of these point lights that are in the scene. And the other thing that I want to point out is by default, you have this skybox in the background. And even though we don't have a directional light or any other type of light besides these 4 point lights, which I have now disabled, the skybox actually is emitting light within the scene. So if we scroll back in here and we take a look, if you go to Window and then you go to Rendering and Light Settings, this is where you can actually change your light, your skybox. So this is the default skybox that you see out here with the blue upper hemisphere and kind of the brown lower hemisphere. But the important thing to note here is that your skybox is a source of your environmental lighting. Now, alternatively, you could switch it to color, and when you switch it to color, you'll notice now that the interior of my virtual environment actually does look like a dark office environment. And in fact, if I wanted to make it darker, I could actually adjust this color and I can make the office environment quite dark, which is fairly interesting. And this is actually the goal for this tutorial. The next thing that I'm going to do here, now that I've made a dark virtual environment, I'm actually going to make it appear as if one of these desktop lights is on. But for the meanwhile, while I'm working with the colors, let's actually turn on some of these other point lights so that I can see what's going on inside of my virtual environment. And I'm going to be working with this desk lamp right here. Now by default, for this particular model, this desk lamp isn't a high fidelity representation of a lamp. It doesn't have a bulb in here. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and create a sphere, and I'm going to use this sphere to represent basically the bulb. So let's scale this sphere down until it's about the size of a bulb, and then let's go ahead and position it where we think it should be relative to the lamp. So I want it just barely poking out so that the user recognizes that there is a bulb basically here. That's pretty much exactly what I'm looking for. Elsewise, you don't really see the bulb. It's just right there, kind of at the tip of the lamp. That looks pretty good. I could even probably bring it out a little bit if I wanted to, just to make it a little bit more prevalent. That looks pretty equal, so we'll go with that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a spotlight, which basically acts as like a flashlight or a cone, and I'm going to co-locate it with this sphere. Let's see, the other thing I want to do here is currently this sphere is located outside by itself. It's not connected to the lamp, so I want to make sure it's a child of the lamp. So here's our lamp, and let's collapse some of these hierarchies and drag our sphere underneath the lamp. So now the lamp and the sphere, which we'll go ahead and rename to bulb, have properly been set. Now, the next thing that I want to do is go ahead and create a spotlight. So I'll go to Game Object Light, and I will add a spotlight. And that happens to get added in the exact same location as my sphere, or should be. So we'll go ahead and put it underneath the bulb, and we'll make sure it's at 0, 0, 0, so it's completely lined up. However, I will have to adjust the direction of the light. Currently, it's pointed straight down, which is not what I want. So I'm going to have to actually rotate it. So I'll use the rotate widget. I need to rotate it about 90 degrees that way. And then we need to rotate it up. Approximately there probably looks pretty good. Yeah, I think that's probably good enough for now. And now let's turn off those other lights that we had and take a look to see how this, how our little desk lamp works. So I'm going to select these other point lights, turn them off. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to actually hide our gizmos. So here we see our little desk lamp. Kind of interesting, but also doesn't look very realistic. A few issues here. One, the light is actually penetrating through. It's also not quite the range that I would expect. So let's go back to our spotlight. In terms of it going through the material properties, this is actually primarily due to not properly casting shadows. So I'm going to change it from no shadows to some soft shadows. I'm also going to increase its angle just a little bit so that it's illuminating a little bit more of the desk. Notice by doing so that does eliminate some of the light basically bleeding through. And if you have other settings here you can adjust. You can adjust the bias a little bit if you want to. You can affect with the normal bias as well. That doesn't do quite as much. The near plane does have some effects depending on how you have it set up. Probably closer to -1 is a little bit more, or to 0.1 is a little bit more realistic. So this is pretty spot on for what I want in terms of the light effect. I could also affect the range if I wanted to, which I'm not getting too much range here, but if I wanted to, I could obviously affect the color. So if I wanted to make it yellow instead of a white, I definitely could do that, but I'm going to stick with white. And then again, you could change the intensity, but you do have to be careful with intensities. They do have a tendency of basically bleaching out your colors within your scene. So I'm essentially just going to go with an intensity of 2. Now, one last thing to note here is if you'll take a look at the bulb doesn't look very realistic. And the reason for that is because the bulb itself is not highlighted. We can actually do this by using a material property. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new folder here. I'm going to call it materials. I'm going to right click. I'm going to click create, and I'm going to click material, and I'm going to call this light bulb. And in general, it's a white material as normal, but the key thing here is I'm going to make it an emission material by checking this box and then setting the color to bright white. And now if I apply this light bulb to my sphere, it now looks like I have a bright bulb. And if that appears to be emitting too much light, I definitely could tone that down a little bit just by going back here and basically lowering the color a little bit. That might be a little bit more realistic. Again, this is very artistic and kind of aesthetic. It depends on your personal opinion. And now if we go into my virtual environment from the first person perspective, you see it's a very dark environment. This could be something like a creepy office horror game. And then if we move over here, we have this desktop light illuminating the desktop. This actually would serve very well for like a story cue, for example, if the user needed to pay attention to something, or maybe the keyboard was the next thing that the user needed to interact with. This would be a good way of cueing the user that they need to pay attention to this part of the scene. So in this tutorial, I've showed you how we can light indoor environments, how you can turn the lights on and off, how you can set their property values, how you can affect the overall skyboxes and how much general light, ambient light is being emitted by the skyboxes, and also how you can add spotlights such as this desktop lamp using the Unity game object light options.